Hello there. Okay, lovely day here in the UK. I'm just sort of walking, just have a quick look here. Some nice sort of little sort of canals or river inlets or whatever you want to call them. I'm on the Isle of Thanet near Minster, on the way to Ramsgate. As I say, this is, apart from all the pylons, this countryside would probably hasn't changed that much for hundreds of years. And obviously I'm walking an old pilgrimage trail that's dedicated to Saint Augustine. So the story is that Saint Augustine landed somewhere near Ramsgate and then walked to Canterbury. So, walked to Rochester Cathedral, or where Rochester Cathedral is now. To bring the sort of Roman Catholic, well, it wouldn't have been called Catholic then, it would have been the Roman Church ideas to England. Obviously there's already a Celtic, what we could term as a Celtic Christianity here. So obviously at the time of recording this, there's all of this kerfuffle with tariffs and Trump and lots of people having their say. And of course, unfortunately nowadays, you get locked into an echo chamber. So all I'm hearing and seeing is stuff that is not pro-Trump. The fact that historically tariffs don't work in the way that we expect them to work. And I was watching a CNN news item, if you like, and it was on YouTube, saying how Trump and I can't remember the guy's name, but one of the sort of architects of the tariff ideas was saying how good this is, and reading the economic reports and results in a good light, when of course it seems patently obvious that they're absolutely catastrophic. And I sort of was pondering how you can spin a story and brings it back to that idea that there are lies, and there are damned lies, and then there are statistics. And is that sort of thing of how we interpret the information that we're getting. So how we build the narrative story of who we are, where we are, and what those things mean in a bigger picture. And if there is a bigger picture. And I started thinking about Edward Bernays. Now, I mentioned Edward Bernays in my book about creative thinking, music, magic and NLP. Because Bernays wrote a book called Propaganda. Now, Bernays is one of these characters who is really important, but virtually nobody knows who he is, because obviously he's not a name that would sort of come out and be instantly recognisable. But his mother was Anna Freud. And if you think that's interesting, because she shares the Freud name, she was the sister of Sigmund Freud. So Sigmund Freud was Edward Bernays' uncle. So Bernays was born in Vienna, I believe, in about 1891. And he lived until he was 104. So an extraordinarily long life. And he, in his time, wrote about the psychology of messaging or language, or as he would term it, propaganda. Now, one of his great admirers was Goebbels. And the Nazi propaganda machine was heavily inspired by Edward Bernays. Now, Bernays, I don't believe, was a fascist. I'm not saying that at all. But his insights into how language and propaganda works was used heavily by the Nazis. So it's this idea of creating a story and then, propagating the myth, if you like. Being able to read information in a particular way that sets out your vision of the future. Now, this is not new, obviously. This is something that was probably codified by Bernays, because any form of philosophical or religious thought is based on a story, whether that story is a creation myth, whether that's of a god or the earth, or even yourself, where you come from. Now, we often sort of take the mickey out of characters like, the sort of North Korean leadership for the sort of nonsense which is their origin myth. But of course, this is actually like a modern version of a very old idea. That you were either, in the case of the pharaohs, directly linked to a god or a goddess, which is also the case of the Japanese emperor's family, that they are literally the son of the goddess of the moon or something like that. I don't, down to the story of somebody like Trump as the great businessman, which, if you know anything about Trump, he definitely isn't. I know lots of business people have terrible failures and they only need one or two things to really make the money, whereas lots of other things can lose money, but overall they've made money. But a lot of Trump's money came via the government back in the, I think it was the 1970s, where he managed to redevelop a part of the city and build, Trump Tower. So he's basically given a free handout. And of course, once you've got money, as in the old adage, money makes money. So you're on an upward trajectory. The biggest problem is when you don't have any money, and it's actually quite difficult to get that magnetic effect that money has. But the stories that are told about these characters are quite unbelievable. Well, they are unbelievable, but most successful stories are unbelievable. So where does that come into the sort of creative myth making that, could be beneficial? So while I was sort of thinking about this, every story that we have has that element to it, even if it leads to something that is really useful for society, like the National Health Service, for instance. This idea that you're working your whole life to pay for, it's sort of almost your treatment on the national health, when of course really what's happening is the national health is being paid for by the people that are working now, not so much your contributions as such. I mean, obviously that's all debatable, but it's, you haven't got a kitty that you've built up from your years of work. So this is quite sort of a fascinating aspect to how we think about the stories that we tell. And I'm just going to turn around and walk back, because the way I do these walks is I do sections, and I've really reached the end of the section that I need to do, and it's also incredibly overgrown, which it shouldn't be because it's supposed to be maintained. And there's a rickety old bridge which is actually really dangerous at the end, so I approached it from the other side last time. So I'm sort of done with this, so I'm going to turn back and head back now towards Minster and then on towards Ramsgate. So looking at that sort of story about how we're then taken in by those things because they benefit us, is a story that we like, because it says something that offers us some sort of solace in some sort of way, some sort of belief in the future, which is also relevant to, I mentioned Goebbels, because we are pretty much at the anniversary, or coming up to it, to the death of Hitler and the end of the Second World War. And the stories about the Hitler bunker and what people, and Hitler's sort of raving about what still could happen and all the rest of it, even when it was patently obvious, because the Russians were virtually knocking on the door of the bunker, that these things weren't going to happen. And then suddenly he resigns himself to the fact that he didn't fail, but the German people didn't live up to what he thought they should be as the master race, and maybe in his last sort of will and testament, if you like, blamed the Jews for the war and questioned the fact that maybe it wasn't the German people who were the master race. It wasn't him who was at fault. So you might think, well, Hitler was a raving lunatic, but he did pretty well at the beginning. And a lot of people believed in him, not just right to the end, but beyond that. They believed that he was right. And you think, well, because we haven't been faced with that type of indoctrination, I should say, that we find it sort of hard to believe that anybody would take that stuff seriously. When, you know, the evidence was that there was no way that they could have won. It was just a matter of time. But the point is that we do things because, as I say, it offers us an explanation or an excuse for things. So let's have a look at why I'm walking a pilgrimage trail. Now, I'm not a Christian, I must point this out. Am I interested in sort of theosophical and theological thought? Yes, I am, because I think it gives us an interesting window into the human mind. Did people who believed in Jesus, the story of Christ, did some of those people do amazing things? Yes, they did. Did they do some terrible things? Most definitely they did. Did society reform itself in a way that had some structural benefit for people? Yes, I believe it did. And maybe they would not have done that if they hadn't believed in something beyond themselves in such a way that they kept in check the excesses of their behaviour. Maybe to some extent that's true. There are other things that it made it worse. But the thing is, it's still a story. Now, whether Jesus existed or not, and he probably did in some shape or form, you know, it didn't mean that he was going to spawn this extraordinary religious movement. Did Christ believe that that was going to happen? Probably not. Who's to say? And this might ruffle a few feathers, obviously, but I don't really care, to be honest. The point I'm interested in is what's going on in the way that we think, or the way that we seem to think about things. So this would explain why you would get people believing in stuff like Scientology. And I've already done quite a lot of stuff about L. Ron Hubbard and, you know, where his ideas came from. And it certainly wasn't Christianity. Obviously owed a lot of his ideas to Aleister Crowley. Now, the point is that the story was interesting enough for people to be encouraged in some way, literally in the full meaning of that word, have courage of their convictions and their life to live a life that was more outgoing, more dramatic, more dynamic. And I think that's the conundrum that we have. So let's sort of dial that back from a creative, artistic point of view. If you think your artwork is rubbish, and to some extent artists do feel that they're imposters, you know, that's quite normal. But if you have a belief that your work is valid and it says something and it is doing something potent, or you just don't care, you're probably going to be more successful than if you're just an ordinary person that's full of doubt. And you see this in artistic movements such as surrealism I would say Dada, but the thing is that Dada didn't really sort of last that long. But if you look at some of those art movements in the early 20th century, they were dealing with things that were, for instance, with surrealism. It was this idea that it was the unconscious talking. So they would do things that would create a dreamlike reality. You know, it would start off with something that was almost happenstance to start the creative process off. Which again, if you think about my point about cut up, and there is an element of that in surrealism anyway, that sort of makes, it's not you spilling your heart on the paper, it's something else speaking through you, and in that way you're not criticizing yourself on this. So the story is different. The story that you're telling yourself about your artwork is different, or about your life. So let's pivot on that a little bit and think about people who really did make a change in the world historically. Whether that was for good or not is another question. But Alexander the Great is a good example of this. Alexander the Great truly believed he was a god, and therefore he did the most extremely dangerous things. He didn't stand at the back commanding his men, he was at the front. And lots of things happened in such a way that seemed to reinforce the idea that he was chosen, or he was a deity. Which brings me back to Adolf. So at the beginning of Adolf's life, he had a number of things that were close shaves. There was a point where he could have been executed for a political, the putsch, if you like, the sort of little revolution, which went horribly wrong. But he wasn't. In actual fact, it encouraged other people to take him, I would say seriously, to believe that he had some sort of vision. So his story seemed to answer lots of questions for German people. And the reason it was good for them at that point in time was they'd just lost a war. And another story that sort of circulated was that they didn't really lose, they were just cheated by the politicians and by the communists. So you can see how it's so easy to make excuses for your situation and later on your behaviour because of the story that you tell. Now, up to now, really, I've really been pointing out the bad parts of this, but it works in the same way if you want to do good. You know, you want to be creative, you want to be a better father, parent, member of the community and stuff. If your story that you tell yourself in such a way that you believe it has got real potency, then you can change yourself. It's that... But positive thing is not really the right word, because it sounds a bit sort of limp and, you know, new agey from the days of, well, it's much earlier than the 1970s, but you get the idea that you can be anything you want to be and all that sort of stuff. To some extent, you can believe yourself to be anything you want to be. And in the process of doing that, you make different choices. And unconsciously you make different choices. And weirdly, things sort of start to fall into place because unconsciously you spot those choices. Maybe that's what that is. So I think the takeaway bit from that little sort of stuff is, first of all, be very careful what you hear other people tell you. Be very suspect and suspicious of things. You know, And it's not really the case of whether that's the truth for you, but whether it encourages you to be a better person, a more successful person in the way that you live your life, and how happy you are in yourself, and how much you believe that what you do has sort of real validity in your life. Okay, so it's a little rant. Hope that's provided you with some ideas. Remember, if you want to get a copy of my book, which is always lovely for me, if you can get it on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, but you could also get it from me direct, particularly if you're in the UK. You just have to contact me via this podcast, and I can organise something where I can send you a signed copy. And I'm going to be doing some creative projects soon, after I've sort of moved. And some of those will be online, and some of them will be free. So if you're interested in that, you just need to contact me and I'll give you the details. So until next time, I'll see you then. Bye.